Imagine waking up in the dead of night. You're parched, maybe your stomach is rumbling a bit.
All right.
So you throw off the covers and you wander down the dark hallway to your kitchen. The house is completely pitch black.
Sitting the spooky scene, I like it.
Yeah, exactly. So you open the pantry, or maybe a cold storage box, and you look at your leftover dinner. Let's say it's a leg of veal you had prepared earlier that afternoon.
Okay.
But as you look at it in the dark, the meat is glowing. I mean, it is physically emitting a bright, eerie, unmistakable luminescent light.
Oh, wow.
Right. Put yourself in that exact moment standing in your slippers in the dark. What is your immediate, visceral reaction?
Terror. Absolute terror.
Exactly. Are you terrified? Do you drop it and run? Do you think it's like a demon, a ghost, or some kind of terrible warning from the heavens?
More people would, yeah.
Or, and this is the alternative, do you suddenly feel this huge rush of excitement, grab a notebook, and start setting up a makeshift dark room to study the glowing meat?
It really is the ultimate litmus test, isn't it, for how a human being processes the unknown.
It really is.
And what makes that specific scenario so compelling is that it's a documented historical event. It actually happened.
Which is just wild to think about.
Yeah, it happened to a servant in the late 17th century, and her reaction of just absolute paralyzing terror was, well, completely at odds with the reaction of her employer.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We're taking you on a massive journey through the history of a very specific, incredibly powerful concept, which is wonder.
And we aren't just talking about, the fleeting feeling you get when you look at a nice sunset.
Right, no. We're talking about wonders as actual physical objects and anomalies. We're looking at the High Middle Ages right through to the Enlightenment.
Yeah, it's a huge span of time.
It is. And our primary guide for this exploration is a landmark piece of historical research. It's the text Wonders and the Order of Nature 1150 to 1750 by historians Lorraine Daston and Catherine Park.
Such a fantastic book.
It's an incredible resource. We're also bringing in vivid accounts from medieval manuscripts, ancient maps, travel diaries, all sorts of things.
And our mission today goes far beyond just cataloging bizarre mythical creatures.
Although we do have some truly spectacular ones to discuss.
Oh, definitely. But we were tracing how the very definition of the impossible and the marvelous shifted over centuries.
Right.
And how those shifting definitions literally laid the foundations for modern science. We're really looking at how our ancestors tried to draw a boundary line between the natural, the preternatural, and the supernatural.
So let's go back to that glowing veal in the dark. Set the scene for us. Who was this employer, and what actually happened?
So the year is 1672, and the employer of that terrified servant is Robert Boyle.
Okay, the famous scientist.
Exactly. He's one of the foundational figures of modern chemistry and the scientific method. So his servant goes to the larder in the middle of the night, sees this glowing meat, and is just absolutely panic-stricken.
I mean, I would be too.
Right. In her worldview, meat does not glow unless something deeply unnatural and likely malevolent is at work. So she wakes up the whole household.
Just total chaos.
Yeah, and the news finally reaches Boyle. Now, Boyle is nursing a terrible headache. He's exhausted from spending the evening trying out a new experimental telescope. He is literally in the middle of undressing to go to sleep, but when he hears about this glowing leg of veal, he doesn't cower. And he certainly doesn't go to bed.
He practically sprints to the kitchen, right?
He is filled with what the texts describe as wonder and delight. He immediately orders the meat to be brought to his private chamber.
In the middle of the night?
Yes.
Yeah.
He sets up a dark room right there on the spot. Despite his illness and the hour, he starts running impromptu experiments.
That is just incredible dedication.
He notes that the meat shines like, quote, rotten wood or stinking fish. He's observing how the light behaves when he touches it, when he changes the airflow. I mean, he is having the absolute time of his life investigating this anomaly.
I just love that image. The servant is probably, praying for her immortal soul, and Robert Boyle is treating it like a surprise Christmas present.
It's a perfect contrast.
But there is a deep philosophical divide happening in that kitchen. The text makes a point of splitting wonder into two different categories here, right?
Yeah, what's fascinating here is the dual nature of the concept. Daston and Park lay out wonder in two distinct but connected ways.
Okay, break that down for us.
First, there is wonder as an object. So the glowing veal itself.
The physical thing.
Exactly. It is a physical anomaly that marks the outermost limits of what is considered natural. It's a tangible thing you can point your finger at.
Right. Okay.
But then there is wonder as a passion. And this is the visceral cognitive emotion that Boyle is experiencing. It is the internal alarm bell that registers a breached boundary between the known and the unknown.
So it isn't just a feeling of, oh wow, that's pretty. It's intellectual reflex.
Yeah, it goes much deeper than passive appreciation. René Descartes, writing slightly earlier in the 17th century, actually called wonder the first of the passions.
The first of the passions, that's a strong statement.
He defined it as a sudden surprise of the soul. For Descartes and Boyle, wonder was a mobilization of the mind.
It wakes you up.
Exactly. It was a cognitive passion that forced you to attentively consider objects that seemed rare and extraordinary. It was the spark that ignited scientific inquiry.
But the way Boyle sees the world, this idea that you can just study the anomaly, that's fundamentally different from how people saw the world a few centuries earlier, right?
Now completely different.
Because the servant's reaction, it's actually a hangover from an older medieval worldview. How did the medieval mind categorize something like glowing meat compared to Boyle's modern scientific mind?
It all comes down to how a society defines the rules of the universe. In the medieval and early modern order, nature wasn't viewed as a machine.
Okay.
Nature was governed by what philosophers of the time called customs. Nature had habits.
Habits? Like it just usually does things a certain way.
Right. It usually did things a certain way, but because they were just habits, there was room for exceptions. This allowed for a whole category of reality called the preternatural.
Meaning things that are beyond the normal, but not necessarily miraculous.
Precisely. Preternatural marvels were highly unusual, but they didn't require God to actively break the universe to make them happen. They were just rare phenomena where nature was sort of playing around or deviating from her usual routine.
Okay, let me see if I can unpack this. It's like the medieval view of nature is a strict school teacher, but one who occasionally lets the class have a free play day.
That's a great way to think of it.
Right, like the customs are there, the rules of the classroom are established, but they can occasionally be bent or relaxed without the whole school burning down.
Exactly.
But the modern view, one Boyle is helping to usher in for enlightenment, views nature as a rigid computer program.
That is a very apt way to look at it. The modern view argues that nature is everywhere and always the same. The laws are uniform and inviolable, ironclad regularities.
Right, so if a piece of meat glows in a way it is not programmed to glow, that is an impossible system crash.
Yes, exactly.
Under the modern view, the only way the rules of the computer program can be broken is if the programmer God reaches in from the outside and executes a divine miracle.
Right, there's no wiggle room.
So Boyle's looking at the veal trying to figure out the hidden lines of code, whereas the medieval mind would just say, oh, nature's having a weird day.
And because the medieval mind believed nature could have a weird day and bend its own rules, they believed these rule-breaking phenomena didn't just happen randomly.
What do you mean?
They believed there were specific places where nature's customs were naturally looser. They had a literal, physical geography of the impossible.
A geography of the impossible. So, if it's a geography, someone must have tried to map it out. Who was keeping track of all these preternatural free play days?
To understand that topography of wonder, we really have to look at the great encyclopedists of the Middle Ages. One of the most prominent was an English nobleman and imperial counselor named Gervase of Tilbury.
Okay, Gervase Tilbury.
Yeah. Around the year 1210, he was living in Arles in the south of France, and he wrote a massive manuscript called the Otia Imperialia, which translates to Recreation for an Emperor.
Sounds fancy.
He wrote it for Emperor Otto IV, and he dedicates the longest, most detailed section of this book to what he calls the marvels of every province.
So he is basically writing a global travel guide of the bazaar for the emperor.
Basically, yeah.
What kind of things actually make the cut for this encyclopedia?
The list is just staggering in its variety. It mixes things we would consider basic biology with pure mythology. Gervase writes about magnets from India that attract iron, treating them with the exact same level of awe as he treats a local rumor about werewolves.
Wait, werewolves?
Yeah, which he casually mentions are just a, quote, daily event in his neighborhood.
Wait, really? He just drops werewolves in there as a daily occurrence.
He totally does. He also catalogs a garden in Naples, supposedly planted by the ancient Roman poet Virgil, that features a magical bronze fly that repels all other flies from the city.
That would be incredibly useful, honestly.
Right. He lists Veronica's napkin in Rome, which supposedly held the miraculous imprint of Christ's face. He details a race of Egyptian storkmen.
Forkmen.
Yeah, people 12 feet tall who can metamorphose into storks. The self-immolating phoenix is in there, and he includes creatures called dracs.
Drax, like dragons?
Not exactly. According to Gervais, dracs lived in the Rhone River. They were creatures that could shape-shift into golden rings floating on the surface of the water.
Oh, that sounds like a trap.
It was. They did this specifically to lure greedy women and children who would reach into the water to grab the gold, at which point the drac would drag them under.
That sounds exactly like a parent making up a terrifying bedtime story just to keep their kids away from the edge of a fast-moving river.
Oh, almost certainly.
But to a modern ear, this entire list sounds like pure chaos. You've got magnetism, mythical birds, religious relics, and shape-shifting river monsters all jumbled together.
It does seem random to us.
Did Gervais have any kind of organizing principle, or was he just writing down every single rumor he ever heard?
He actually had a highly structured psychology behind what he chose to include. Gervais believed that the psychology of wonder stemmed from two specific things: the experience of the novel or unexpected, and ignorance of cause.
Meaning, if you have never seen it before, or you just don't understand the mechanism of how it works, it qualifies as a wonder.
Yes, and this brings us to a brilliant concept highlighted in the text, which is the relativity of the beholder.
Relativity of the beholder, okay.
Gervais understood that a wonder is only a wonder based on your own customary experience. He uses a fantastic example, actually pulling an idea from St. Augustine. He points out the chemical reaction of quicklime catching fire when you throw it in cold water.
Which is just a standard exothermic reaction.
Exactly, and to a medieval stonemason or builder who works with lime every day, this is a boring, predictable event.
Right, it's just Tuesday for them.
But Gervais notes, if you took that same lime, traveled to a place where they had never seen it, and told them it was a magical stone from India that burned in freezing water, they would be utterly stupefied with wonder.
Oh, wow. So he is acknowledging that wonder is entirely subjective.
He is.
The magic is literally just science you aren't used to yet.
He is acknowledging the subjectivity, but he still believes that the further you travel from your own customary experience, the more likely you are to encounter things that are genuinely, objectively marvelous.
Like the further away from home you go, the looser the rules get.
Exactly. They map these wonders onto the physical edges of the known world, and the ultimate visual representation of this is the Hereford map.
I've actually seen pictures of this. It's a massive, incredibly dense map.
It is a stunning artifact, created by Richard of Holdingham in England in the 1280s. It's drawn on a single, giant sheet of vellum. It's a circular map, and in the very center, the anchor point of their reality is Jerusalem. The center of the map, encompassing Europe and the Mediterranean, is depicted as normal. That is where things follow the standard, boring customs of nature.
But as your eyes move outward on the vellum,
As you move toward the margins, toward the edges of Africa and India, the visual language of the map changes completely. The text notes that this is where nature, quote, plays with greater freedom.
so it's free play day on the edges.
The margins are literally teeming with illustrations of impossible beings.
Give me some examples of what's lurking on the edges of this map.
Well, you have the Cyopodes, which are a race of humans born with one single giant foot.
Just one huge foot.
Yeah, the map shows them lying on their backs, using their massive foot like an umbrella to shade themselves from the blistering desert sun.
That's incredibly creative.
You also have the Androgenes, who possess both sexes, and perhaps most famously, you have the Blemmies.
The Blemmies, what are they?
These are a race of men with no heads at all. Their faces, so their eyes, nose, mouth, are built right into their chests.
Okay, wait, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because there seems to be a massive contradiction here.
How so?
If highly educated men like Gervais of Tilbury understood the relativity of the beholder, and they knew that a lot of this was just, quote, ignorance of causes, unquote, why compile this massive, fantastical encyclopedia for the emperor?
Ah, I see what you mean.
Right. Why is Richard of Holdingham drawing headless men on a map? If they suspected it was just misunderstood geography or chemistry, why didn't they try to debunk it? Why not write a scientific manual explaining that stork men probably aren't real?
Because debunking wasn't the goal. The goal was pleasure.
Pleasure.
We have to strip away our modern impulse to sanitize and fact-check everything and look at the cultural context of a medieval aristocratic court. Wonder was a highly prized, pleasurable commodity.
Oh, so this is going to be amazing.
Absolutely. Books like the Otia Imperialia were written for entertainment and relaxation. They were designed to showcase the immense, delightful variety of God's creation.
So it's more like an exotic cabinet of curiosities than a textbook.
Exactly. To explain away the shape-shifting Dracs or the headless Blemmies would be to rob the Emperor of the sheer joy of imagining them. The nobility wanted the world to be vast, mysterious, and overflowing with endless variety. Wonder was a luxury item.
They wanted the world to be weird.
They really did.
But what I find so fascinating in Daston and Park's research is that European intellectuals didn't always feel this way. The idea that the unknown margins of the map were fun or entertaining was actually a much later development.
Yes, that's a crucial point.
The emotional tone of how they viewed the exotic East underwent a dramatic 180-degree shift between the 8th century and the 14th century.
The transformation is staggering, honestly. If we look at the earlier medieval period, say the 8th century, the margins of the world were not seen as delightful at all. No, they were viewed with absolute existential terror. The text brings up an 8th century Anglo-Latin manuscript called the Liber Monstrum, or the Book of Monsters, and the tone of this book is deeply, fundamentally paranoid.
Paranoia is a great way to describe it. What kind of monsters are they worried about in the 8th century?
The author writes about the dark, unexplored edges of the world as a landscape of predators. It is full of harpies, cannibals, and giant ants that mine gold.
Giant gold mining ants, okay.
But one of the most telling entries is about an island in the Red Sea. The author claims this island is inhabited by a people who can speak every single human language.
Which sounds like a great diplomatic skill until you hear why they learn the languages.
Right. The author warns that they only speak all languages so they can call out passing sailors in the sailors' native tongues, lure them onto the island with a false sense of familiarity, and then eat them raw.
It's a total horror movie setup.
It really is.
The East is an adversary. It's this dark, threatening realm that is constantly trying to trick and consume the Christian West.
Precisely.
But then we move forward a few hundred years to the 12th century, and the tone shifts again. It moves away from pure terror and becomes highly political. The text highlights a writer named Gerald of Wales.
Yes, Gerald of Wales writes a text called the Topographia Hiberni, the Topography of Ireland, in 1185. And his approach to wonders is incredibly calculated.
How so?
Well, he writes about Ireland's natural marvels with absolute delight. He praises the fact that Ireland has no poisonous reptiles. He is fascinated by their petrifying wells, where a piece of wood dropped into the water slowly turns to stone.
But he draws a very sharp, very dangerous line between the nature of Ireland and the people of Ireland, doesn't he?
He creates a devastating separation. Gerald was a royal clerk, and he wrote this text shortly after King Henry II of England sent him to Ireland as part of a military conquest.
Ah, so there's an agenda.
A huge agenda. Gerald needed to justify why the English were invading, so he uses the human element, the Irish people themselves, as his monsters. He portrays their practices as horrible, barbaric, and incestuous. He paints them as existing outside the laws of civilized humanity.
So he essentially weaponizes the concept of the monster.
Exactly.
If nature acts against her own laws to produce a petrifying well, that is a beautiful wonder. But if the people supposedly transgress the moral order, they are horrors that deserve to be conquered. He's using wonder as propaganda for a land grab.
It is a really dark chapter in the history of the concept. But as we move into the 13th and 14th centuries, we see another massive shift. The terror of the 8th century fades, the political weaponization of the 12th century recedes, and we enter an era of pure romance, trade, and empathy. This is the era of the great travel writers like John Mandeville, Odoric of Pordenone, and of course, Marco Polo.
And what caused this shift? Why did Europe suddenly stop being terrified of the margins?
It was driven by massive geopolitical changes, primarily the Pax Mongolica, or the Mongol peace.
Look at the Mongol Empire.
Yeah, the Mongol Empire had stabilized a vast stretch of Eurasia, which opened up the Silk Road and other trade routes. For the first time, significant numbers of European diplomats, missionaries, and merchants were actually traveling to these distant places.
Going out to the margins themselves.
Exactly. And when they got there, they didn't find man-eating monsters. They found immense wealth, complex civilizations, luxury textiles, and spices.
So reality finally crashed into the mythology.
Big time.
Marco Polo's descriptions of the East are practically ecstatic. When he describes the Indian kingdom of Quilon, he is just overflowing with adjectives. He talks about seeing flash lions, tiny beautiful parrots, and peacocks that are larger and handsomer than anything back in Europe.
Everything is a marvel.
Everything is different, and everything is better. But there is a fascinating backstory to how Marco Polo's book was actually written that helps explain why it sounds so magical.
The authorship of Marco Polo's famous travels is a great literary twist. Marco Polo was a merchant, but he didn't sit down at a desk and write this book himself.
Right, he dictated it.
Yeah, in 1298, Polo was a prisoner of war in Genoa. To pass the time, he dictated his travels to a fellow prisoner, but this fellow prisoner was a man named Rustichello of Pisa.
And Rustichello was not a geographer, and he wasn't a merchant. He wrote romances,
Arthurian romances. Specifically, he was a writer of chivalric fiction.
which explains so much.
It does. So Rustichello takes Polo's dry merchant observations about trade goods and distances, and he dresses them up in the rhapsodic rhetoric of courtly romance.
Just slams it up completely.
He injects the language of marvelous quests, exotic settings, and magical diversity. He effectively transforms the geographic East into a literary fantasy that the European courts just devoured.
We can actually see this transformation from terror to romance in the visual art of the time. The text compares two different illustrations of the Cynocephali.
Right, the Cynocephali being the mythical race of dog-headed men believed to live in the East.
Right, if you look at an 11th century manuscript, the dog-headed men are drawn as raving, terrifying beasts. They are naked, aggressive, and look like absolute monsters.
Pure horror.
But fast forward to the early 15th century, to an illustration produced by the famous Boudica workshop in France. The dog-headed man in this later image is completely different.
Oh, it's night and day.
He is wearing beautiful, civilized, tailored European merchant clothing. He's standing calmly next to a castle, engaging in peaceful trade. He isn't a monster coming to eat you. He's a highly fashionable business partner.
That visual shift perfectly encapsulates the New World view. There's a quote from James of Vitry, a 13th century bishop, that captures this emerging empathy. He wrote, quote, "Perhaps the Cyclops marvel as much at those who have two eyes as we marvel at them." It is a stunning moment of cultural relativism. They're beginning to realize that normal is entirely subjective.
So what does this all mean? I think the best way to understand this is to look at how our own modern culture views outer space.
Oh, that's an interesting parallel.
If you look at science fiction movies from the 1950s, right during the height of the Cold War and nuclear anxiety, aliens are almost always terrifying, with brain-eating, saucer-flying invaders coming to destroy our suburbs.
Very true.
It's pure paranoia, just like the Liber Monstrum. But look at modern sci-fi franchises like Star Trek or Mass Effect. We imagine a galaxy full of complex, civilized alien trade federations. We imagine interspecies diplomacy and cultural exchange.
Yeah, we want to trade with the aliens, not shoot them.
Our view of the unknown margins reflects our own geopolitical confidence and our own societal desires. When Europe was isolated and scared in the Dark Ages, the margins were full of man-eating monsters. When Europe became commercially expansive and wealthy, the margins became full of romantic trade partners.
That is a phenomenal parallel. The perception of the marvel changed because the needs of the society changed. Wonders shifted from being threats to being commodities of exchange.
Actual commodities.
Yes. The text notes how European travelers would actually barter with stories. A European merchant would happily trade a story about European barnacle geese, which were mythical geese that supposedly grew on trees in Ireland, for an Asian merchant story about Scythian lambs, which were little lambs that grew out of gourds on plants.
Just trading weird nature facts.
It was an intellectual barter system, exchanging one delightful wonder for another.
Okay, so secular merchants and aristocratic courts are turning wonders into romanticized commodities and, like, cocktail party trivia. But what about the church?
The church.
Religion was the dominant intellectual and cultural force of this entire era. How did theologians handle this explosion of bizarre information? They couldn't just treat headless men and shape-shifting river tracks as a fun diversion, right?
They absolutely did not treat it as a diversion. Theologians had a very specific, deeply serious use for wonders. And to understand this, we have to trace the theology of wonder all the way back to St. Augustine in the 4th and 5th centuries.
Exactly, okay.
Augustine used marbles as foundational tools to prove complex theological concepts.
How does a marble prove a theology?
Well, Augustine faced a very specific problem. He had to prove to skeptics that God could make human bodies burn forever in hell without those bodies being completely consumed to ash and destroyed.
Which is a tough sell from a basic physics standpoint. Fire destroys flesh.
Exactly. So to prove that God could suspend the normal rules of physics, Augustine pointed to what he believed were known marvels in the natural natural world. He pointed to the salamander, which medieval people believed could live inside a fire without burning.
Oh, fascinating.
And he pointed to Mount Etna in Sicily, a volcano that burns continuously without ever running out of fuel. His thesis was simple. Everything God created is wonderful.
So a marvel is just proof of God's power.
A marvel is simply God choosing to change the nature of something to suit his will. If God can make a salamander fireproof and a mountain burn forever, he can certainly make a damned soul burn eternally in hell.
That is a very intense use of a nature fact.
It is.
He is using biology, or at least what he thought was biology, as a key to decode divine punishment. And this religious framing leads us to the bestiaries, the lapidaries, and the herbals of the Middle Ages.
Yes, the great catalogs.
These are books that catalog animals, stones, and plants. But if you read them, you quickly realize they are not biology textbooks.
They are moral decoder rings. The medieval mind believed that God wrote two books, the Bible and the Book of Nature, and both needed to be read allegorically.
Like everything has a hidden meaning.
Exactly. The bestiaries assigned deep spiritual meaning to the physical traits of animals. The text gives us the example of the panther.
But in a medieval bestiary, the panther is not just a big jungle cat. It is described as having breath so incredibly sweet that all other animals in the forest are irresistibly drawn to it.
Which is quite an image.
And the bestiary explicitly allegorizes this. The panther represents Jesus Christ, whose sweet message draws all people to him.
Every animal had a job to do in the moral universe. But what happens when they encounter something so bizarre it defies allegory? The text brings up the manticore, a creature from India.
Oh man, the description of the manticore is pure nightmare fuel.
It really is.
The text describes it as having a triple row of teeth, a human face, a lion's body, a scorpion's tail, and a hissing voice.
Just a horrific chimera.
And what I found so wild about this entry is that the bestiary doesn't even attempt to allegorize it. It doesn't say, oh, the triple row of teeth represents the Holy Trinity or anything like that.
No, it skips the allegory entirely.
It just presents this terrifying, unallegorized horror that delights in eating human flesh. It's like the monk writing the book just threw his hands up and said, I have no idea what moral lesson God is trying to teach us here, but this thing is horrifying.
It proves that while theologians tried valiantly to fit everything into a neat, allegorical framework, the sheer weirdness and brutality of the world sometimes resisted simple categorization.
It broke their system.
But this strict religious framing of nature didn't remain static. By the 1240s, we see the creation of massive, comprehensive encyclopedias by friars like Thomas of Cantimpré, Vincent of Beauvais, and Bartholomeus Anglicus.
When we say massive, we mean colossal. Vincent of Beauvais' encyclopedia contained nearly 4,000 chapters.
It was a monumental undertaking.
What was the original purpose of compiling all of this?
Originally, these were highly practical tools. They were field guides designed for Dominican and Franciscan friars to use when writing and delivering sermons.
So sermon prep.
Yeah. If a preacher needed to keep a rural congregation awake on a Sunday morning, he could pull a fascinating story about a monstrous race or a magical stone from the encyclopedia and then weave a moral lesson into it. It was engaging material for the pulpit.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the audience for these books didn't stay in the church. Over the next century or two, the readership shifted drastically, and Daston and Park point out that we can literally see this audience changing just by looking at the illustrations in the manuscripts over time.
The visual evidence is striking. If you look at an early 13th century copy of Bartholomeus Anglicus's encyclopedia, the illustration shows Bartholomeus standing in a plain, austere room, teaching a group of soberly dressed clerics and monks.
Very serious, very academic.
It is a serious academic religious setting.
But then you look at a translated French manuscript of the exact same text from a few decades later. The illustration is completely different.
It's a whole new world.
Bartholomeus is no longer teaching monks. He is standing in a lavish court, lecturing to royalty. He is surrounded by nobles, like Count Barad III and King Charles VI, who are draped in expensive furs and heavy jewels.
The religious moralizing framework has fallen away. The Encyclopedia of Wonders has been stripped of its theological utility and has become a luxury item. A coffee table book for the mega rich.
Just reading about monsters for fun.
It transitions from pastoral care to aristocratic entertainment.
But let me pause here and ask a practical question. If all these wonders, the exotic animals, the magical stones, the distant races, eventually just become God's wonderful creation meant for our enjoyment, or just fun trivia facts for a king in a fur coat, Did medieval people ever encounter a wonder that actually scared them? Or by the 14th century, was the entire concept of the impossible just fun and games?
That is the crucial question, and the answer reveals a very dark, very rigid dividing line in medieval and early modern science.
Okay, what is it?
They absolutely encountered anomalies that terrified them to their core. But to understand what scared them, we have to understand the profound philosophical difference between what they called a marvelous species and a monstrous individual.
This is where the Greek and Arabic natural philosophy that was filtering into Europe really starts to collide with Christian theology.
Exactly. As the works of Aristotle and brilliant Arabic commentators like Avicenna became widely available in the Latin West, European thinkers developed a much more rigid, categorical understanding of how biological nature worked.
They started classifying things.
They divided the abnormal into two strict categories. The first was marvelous kinds, which we can think of as exotic species.
Give me an example of a marvelous kind.
Entire races of beings fall into this category. The Cenocephali, the dog-headed men, are a marvelous kind. Or a creature mentioned in the text called the Ansibina, which was believed to be a species of snake with a head at both ends of its body.
So these are things that, even though they are bizarre to us, reproduce. They have stable populations, they have habitats, even if those habitats are far away in India or Africa.
Yes. Because they are permanent, regular features of the world generated by natural, repeating biological causes, they are considered a legitimate part of the natural order. God designed them that way from the beginning.
So they're safe.
Therefore, they evoked pleasure, curiosity, and appreciative wonder. But the second category was entirely different. This was the monstrous individual.
What qualifies as a monstrous individual?
A unique, highly localized anomaly. A human baby born with 2 heads in a village in France. A calf born with 5 legs on a nearby farm. A pig with a human face.
So, a biological glitch.
A catastrophic glitch. Because these were singular creations, they didn't come from a stable species. They didn't reproduce.
Right.
Therefore, philosophers argue they were direct suspensions of the natural order. They didn't happen by biological habit. They happened because God specifically intervened to warp the matter in the womb.
They acted contra naturam against nature.
Yes. And because they were a violent rupture in the rules of reality happening right in your own backyard, they evoked absolute horror.
Here's where it gets really interesting. I think the video game analogy works perfectly here.
Oh, wait on me.
Imagine you are playing a massive open world video game. You explore the map and you find a hidden, distant level where the entire world is designed to be upside down.
Okay.
The trees grow down from the sky, the enemies walk on the ceiling. That is a cool, intended feature. The developers programmed it that way. That is a marvelous kind. You explore it, you think it's fun, you tell your friends about it.
The rules are different, but they are stable.
Right? But imagine you were just walking around your home base, the safe zone you've been in for hours, and suddenly your main character's head duplicates. The sky abruptly turns blood red, and NPCs start floating through solid walls.
That's horrifying.
That is not a fun feature. That is a terrifying system error. That is a monstrous individual. It is a flashing red warning light that the code is breaking down, and your save file is about to permanently corrupt.
That captures the emotional reality perfectly. The horror of the monstrous individual isn't just about how the anomaly physically looks. The horror is about what the anomaly means.
Meaning is everything here.
The text cites modern scholars Arnold Davidson and Mary Douglas, who analyze the psychology of this. They explain that horror is always occasioned by the violation of norm.
Right.
An exotic hybrid race of dogmen living in India doesn't violate a norm because they are far away following their own natural customs. They belong there. But a local hybrid, a 2-headed calf in your barn, that violates the divine and moral will of your
And the writer Gerald of Wales gives us the most jaw-dropping, explicit example of this double standard in action.
He really does.
In his writings, he discusses animal hybrids. First, he casually mentions that in the woods of Ireland, stags and cows sometimes mate and produce hybrid offspring. And his tone is completely neutral. He notes it down like he's observing a mildly interesting weather pattern.
Because animals are not bound by human morality. They don't have souls to save or sins to commit. They aren't bound by human sexual prohibitions.
Exactly. But then in the very next breath, Gerald describes a rumored case where a human woman had relations with a goat, producing a human-animal hybrid. And Gerald absolutely loses his mind. His tone changes completely.
He erupts into furious invective. He writes about how reason succumbs outrageously to sensuality, how it is a shameful commerce, a vile abomination.
He's disgusted.
The physical form of the resulting hybrid baby isn't the primary issue for him. It is the moral rupture that produced it. The local monster was physical, undeniable proof of a local hidden sin.
And because these system errors were seen as direct, targeted messages from God about the local moral order, they couldn't just be ignored. You couldn't just file a description of a two-headed baby away in a fun encyclopedia for the king to look at after dinner.
No, absolutely not.
They demanded immediate, real-world action from the community.
This brings us to the urgency of the local prodigy. We have to clearly differentiate between signs and symbols. The exotic races, the wonders of the East, the sweet-smelling panther, those were symbols.
Okay, symbols.
They were theological allegories you could sit by the fire and meditate on at your leisure. But local monsters, comets blazing in the sky, unseasonable weather destroying crops, these were signs.
Portents, omens.
Prodigies. They were deliberate, urgent messages fashioned by God to communicate extreme displeasure. They were the flashing red lights on the dashboard of medieval society.
The warning lights.
Because they were interpreted as signs of impending, doom-predicting political assassinations, massive famines, or invading armies, they required immediate civic action. They had to be documented instantly.
Documentation was key.
The entire town had to engage in public penitence, fasting, and prayer to beg for God's mercy. And because the stakes were literally life and death, absolute proof of credibility was required.
History is absolutely full of these panics. The text gives us some incredible, harrowing examples. Guibert of Nogent, a medieval historian, wrote an account of the revolt of Leon in the year 1116.
Oh, that's a brutal story.
This was a massive, bloody civic disaster where the townspeople overthrew and murdered their bishop. And how did Guibert know this disaster was inevitable? Because he noted that right beforehand, strange flames appeared in the night sky, and a baby was born in the region with two heads and two bodies joined at the loins.
The signs were there.
To Guibert, God had sent the warning signs. People just failed to repent in time.
Or look at the Bayeux Tapestry, one of the most famous artifacts of the Middle Ages, which chronicles the Norman conquest of England in 1066.
Right, the tapestry.
Stitched right into the fabric of this historical record is a depiction of Halley's Comet. It shows the comet blazing ominously in the sky, and King Harold of England looking up at it in absolute terror right before he loses his kingdom and his life as battle. To the people who stitched the tapestry, the comet wasn't just astronomical trivia, it was the divine mechanism of his downfall.
But the story that really stuck with me from Daston and Park's research is the panic over the Florence conjoined twins. The year is 1317. Conjoined twins are born near the city of Florence, Italy, and they survive for 20 days.
That caused an immense uproar.
The city priors, the top government leaders, are thrown into an absolute panic. They literally refuse to let the twins be brought into the government palace. They are terrified that the physical presence of the monster will somehow contaminate the government or signifies immediate catastrophic harm to the city.
The superstition was overwhelming.
The entire city is on edge. And there's this amazing historical footnote. The famous Renaissance poet Petrarch was a 7-year-old boy when this happened. His father actually showed him a picture of the twins and told him to remember it forever.
Think about the impact of that on a child.
It was such a traumatic, impactful civic event that the city actually commissioned a permanent bas-relief carving of the twins to be placed on the wall of the hospital.
Which perfectly illustrates the intense demand for credibility and documentation. When reading about distant marvels, the Storkmen, or the Goldring Drax in Gervais's book readers, gave what the text calls emotional consent.
Emotional consent, like they just went along with the ride.
Exactly. They suspended their disbelief to enjoy the story, much the same way we watch a fantasy movie today. We don't ask for a notary to prove dragons exist in a novel. But for a local prodigy, literal truth was paramount. This wasn't a bedtime story. This was a matter of civic salvation. If a two-headed baby was born, you needed witnesses, official documentation, physical proof, because the entire town's survival depended on reacting properly to the omen.
I just have to stop and think about this for a second. If you were listening to this right now, driving in your car or making dinner, think about how utterly exhausting it must have been to live in that world.
It would be incredibly draining.
Imagine a world where a rare astrological event or a tragic biological birth defect wasn't just a physical occurrence. It wasn't just bad luck or genetics. It was a direct, targeted threat aimed at your town's moral failing. tasks.
Every single anomaly had a target on it.
Every anomaly was a loaded gun pointed at your community by God. It's a heavy, heavy way to walk through the world, constantly looking over your shoulder for a glitch in the matrix that means you're about to be punished.
It was a world entirely saturated with meaning. Nothing was random. Every physical deviation had a heavy moral weight attached to it. And that is the incredible journey we've traced today.
We've covered so much ground.
We really have. We've seen how the categorization of the marvelous wasn't just a fun side project, it was the scaffolding of their intellectual and spiritual reality. We started at the fearful paranoid margins with the Liber Monstrorum, moved to the romanticized chivalric commodities of Marco Polo,
Saw how wonders were weaponized as theological tools by Augustine.
and finally arrived at this rigid, terrifying divide between the natural permanent species and the unnatural, ominous individual.
It's an incredible evolution of human thought, from Robert Boyle's empirical wonder and delight at a glowing piece of veal to the absolute existential terror of a medieval village facing a comet.
It's a journey from fear to inquiry.
And as we wrap up this deep dive into the archives of the impossible, I want to leave you with one final provocative thought. The text we use today includes this beautiful short quote describing the historical study of wonder. It says that looking at these phenomena is like, quote, suddenly illuminating a deeply shadowed landscape.
It is a perfect metaphor for the dawn of scientific inquiry, shining a lantern into the dark corners of superstition.
But look at our modern world today. We like to think we have mapped everything. We have satellites imaging every inch of the globe. We have the human genome fully mapped out. We have the entirety of human knowledge on the internet.
We think we know it all.
We think the map is finished. But what are the new marvels hiding in the shadowed landscape of our own era?
That is a profound question. The margins of our map have moved. They aren't at the edge of the oceans anymore. They are at the edge of our technology.
Exactly. Look at artificial intelligence. We are building and unleashing systems right now that are generating outputs we can no longer trace back to simple human coding.
The black box problem.
AI is hallucinating facts out of thin air. It is generating uncanny, bizarre art that looks like a digital 21st century bestiary. AI systems are inventing their own internal languages that human engineers cannot decipher.
The new preternatural.
As these digital anomalies pop up in our feeds, how are we reacting? Are we acting like Robert Boyle, setting up a dark room with empirical wonder and delight to study the glowing algorithm?
Some of us are.
Or are we retreating to the medieval mindset? Are we treating these AI hallucinations like a monstrous birth? Are we looking at technology as a terrifying portent, a system glitch, warning us that we have fundamentally violated the natural order and that disaster is imminent?
History suggests we are probably doing a bit of both. We are marveling at the novelty while simultaneously fearing the cause. And figuring out which reaction will ultimately win out is the great challenge of our time.
The map is never truly finished. We just keep drawing new monsters on the edges. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us today. Keep looking into the shadows, and we'll see you next time.
Meet your new doll.
I finally got you. We're gonna play forever.
No, please, don't hurt me.
The forest holds its breath now on a bed of mossy ground. Tiny lights begin to gleam like a waking, living dream. Oh, the fungus turns to starlight, a whisper in the endless night, a quiet, luminescent grace illuminating time and space.
Finally got you. We're gonna play forever. No, please, don't hurt me.
meet your new doll. I finally got you. We're gonna play forever.
No, please, don't hurt me.
The forest holds its breath now on a bed of mossy ground. Tiny lights begin to gleam like a waking, living dream. Oh, the fungus turns to starlight, a whisper in the endless night, a quiet, luminescent grace illuminating time and space.